Hello, my dears. This is Grandma Barbara, sitting here on my porch in the quiet town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The sun is setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink while I sip on my chamomile tea. There's something about the stillness of these moments that gives me the strength to finally open up and share a story that's been buried in my heart for over 4 decades. I'm 73 now and I've lived a long life. Some might say it's been a good one, full of joy and love. But like any story, it's not without its shadows. And today, I want to tell you about one of those dark moments, something I've kept hidden for too long. A secret, really. But sometimes, my dears, the hardest stories are the ones that need to be told the most. Before I dive into the depths of it, I want to thank you all for being here, for listening to my story. If you've been following this channel, you know it's all about sharing wisdom, life lessons, and most importantly, experiences that connect us all. If you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you'll consider doing so. Leave a comment, tell me where you're from, and maybe even share a little about yourself. After all, we're a family here, one that listens to each other's stories. Now let's go back, way back to 1970 when I was just 18 years old, living in the small town of Millville, Ohio. We were a simple family, nothing extravagant, but we had everything we needed. My father, Jonah, worked as the manager of a general store in town. He was well respected, always tipping his hat to greet ladies on the street and making everyone smile with his jokes. My mother, Dorothy, was an elementary school teacher. She had a gentle voice and a heart full of love for her students, but she was also always busy, whether she was grading papers or canning vegetables from our garden to help make ends meet. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. It was under our cherry tree, the one that always seemed to have the sweetest fruit, that I met Paul. He was tall, charming, and full of confidence. Little did I know that the man who seemed to be my dream come true would lead me down a path I never expected. I was a young girl, innocent and hopeful. Paul was the kind of man I thought I could trust, and at first I did. But soon, my world would turn upside down, and I would learn that not everything is as it seems. So, grab your cup of tea, sit back, and let me share with you how love, trust, and family can sometimes betray you in ways you never imagined. This is my story, the story of how I learned that even in the darkest times, a light can be found if you look hard enough. Millville, Ohio. A small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. It wasn't the sort of place where things moved quickly or changed much, and that's just how we liked it. I often tell people that growing up in Millville was like living in a storybook, the kind where the pages turn slowly and everything is simple, peaceful. My childhood home was on a quiet street, nestled just far enough from the hustle of the town square to feel secluded, but close enough to walk to the market on a Saturday afternoon. We didn't have much in the way of material things, but we had each other, and that was all we needed. My mother, Dorothy, was a teacher at the local elementary school, and she was beloved by every child she taught. She had a kind smile, a soft voice, and the patience of a saint. I remember sitting on the porch with her in the summer evenings, watching the sunset, as she'd weave stories of the books she was reading for her students. Mom always had a book in hand, whether it was to grade papers, or to crochet, or just to enjoy a moment of peace. She was the heart of our home, always busy but always present when we needed her. My father, Jonah, was the manager of the general store in town. He wasn't a rich man, but he was well-liked and respected. You could always find him standing behind the counter, chatting with customers and cracking a joke to lift their spirits. I'd watch him sometimes as he'd tip his hat to greet the ladies on the street and smile that warm smile of his. He had a quiet dignity about him, a calm presence that made everyone feel at ease. When he came home after work, he'd sit on the porch, transistor radio on the armrest, and listen to the ball games. We'd talk about the weather, the town, or the occasional scandal involving someone from the church. It was simple, but it was enough. And there was that cherry tree in our backyard. I don't know why, but it always seemed to be a symbol of our home, a place where all the neighborhood kids would gather, laughing and stretching to pick the ripest fruit. I loved sitting under that tree, watching the sunlight filter through its leaves, feeling the cool breeze of summer on my face. It was under that very tree that I first saw Paul. It started innocently enough. Paul was helping some of the neighborhood children reach the higher branches, plucking cherries to share with the group. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. I was just a shy girl, trying to bring lemonade out to the children, when I bumped into him. He smiled, and something about it made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just the smile, though, it was the way he spoke to me, as if I were someone important. "Be careful with those branches, miss," he said, his deep voice catching my attention. "You wouldn't want to break them." I was immediately taken by his warmth, his friendliness. It wasn't long before he started showing up at our house more frequently. Sometimes he would ask if we needed help carrying groceries. Other times he'd offer to fix things around the house. It was an old-fashioned kind of courtship, and at first I thought nothing of it. He was kind, respectful, and attentive. My parents approved of him immediately, as if they knew what I didn't. Paul was exactly the kind of man you wanted to marry. He had a good job at the bank, he was well-mannered, and he seemed like the perfect gentleman. Our courtship felt like something out of a storybook. We'd meet at the park for walks, have long conversations by the pond, and exchange little notes that would get tucked into books we borrowed from the local library. There was no rush. Everything about it felt safe, like I could breathe easily and just be myself. It wasn't perfect, of course. No marriages. But in those early years, the simplicity of life in Millville, Ohio, with Paul by my side, felt like all I ever needed. I had dreams of one day filling the second bedroom with a child of my own, just as my mother had done. Life was about little moments, small joys, and the steady, predictable rhythm of the days that made up our life. Looking back, I can see how that simplicity gave me the foundation I needed. The love of my family, the quiet support of my father and mother, and the trust that I placed in Paul made me believe that everything would always be simple and good. But as we all know, life has a way of throwing challenges our way, things we can't always predict, no matter how perfect they seem. In the next chapter, you'll hear about how that simplicity slowly began to unravel. How everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family started to change in ways I never expected. But for now, I want you to remember this. Sometimes the peace of a simple life can be both a blessing and a hiding place, hiding from the truths we're not ready to face. It was the summer of 1970, and Millville was in full bloom. The small town was alive with the hum of cicadas in the trees, the laughter of children running through sprinklers, and the faint smell of freshly mowed grass. It was a perfect moment in time, one that felt timeless, as though nothing could disrupt the peace I'd always known. Then, just like that, everything changed with a single encounter. I was 18 years old, standing outside on the porch of our little house, a glass of lemonade in hand. I had just finished running an errand for Mom, picking up some fresh vegetables from the local market. The warm breeze played through my hair, and I was feeling content, but that was before I saw him. Paul. I didn't expect him at all, but there he was, walking down the street with a smile on his face that made my heart skip a beat. Paul was tall, with dark, neatly combed hair and eyes the color of honey. He was stopping to help some of the younger kids reach the cherries hanging from our tree, which was a neighborhood favorite. It wasn't just his good looks that drew me in, though. There was a certain way he moved, a confidence that made him seem older than his 22 years, but still kind and approachable. "Be careful not to break those branches," I said, trying to sound stern as I stepped out onto the porch, but already feeling my cheeks flush. He turned, his eyes catching mine, and offered a warm smile. "Sorry," he said with a twinkle in his eyes, "just helping these kids. This tree's got more cherries than any one family can pick, don't you think?" His voice was calm, inviting, and warm, like something you could lean into and trust. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. From that first moment, something shifted inside of me. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was definitely something close. Paul's presence filled a space I didn't even know I had left open. He began visiting our house regularly. Sometimes he'd come by under the pretense of needing lemons or offering help with groceries. But each visit was the same, polite, respectful, and always ending with that same friendly smile. Over time, I found myself looking forward to those moments, even if they were just brief conversations at the gate or the times we ran into each other at the park. Paul's visits were comforting, like a breath of fresh air on a warm day. My parents liked him immediately. He was everything they could have hoped for in a future son-in-law. He was well-mannered, respectful, and had a steady job at the local bank. He was the kind of man who everyone in town could trust, and I was no exception. In fact, I started to see him as someone who could bring stability and joy to my life, someone who would make everything better. It was exactly what I thought I needed. Our courtship unfolded like a slow, gentle dance. We went for long walks after dinner, talked about everything and nothing at all, and exchanged little notes tucked into books we borrowed from the library. I had always dreamed of finding someone who saw me the way Paul did. Someone who would make me feel special, loved, and understood. And that's exactly how I felt when I was around him. Every day with him seemed like a dream I didn't ever want to end. In 1972, after nearly 2 years of dating, we got married in a simple but beautiful ceremony at the First Baptist Church. The day was filled with joy, love, and a sense of promise for the future. My wedding dress was sewn by Aunt Carmen, the cake was made by Mom, and we had a small reception at the church hall decorated with flowers from our own garden. We didn't have much, but it felt like we had everything we needed. We were young, full of dreams, and ready to build a future together. Looking back, I see now that everything felt so perfect, too perfect, almost like a storybook. But in every story, there comes a moment when the illusion begins to crumble, even if you're not yet ready to face it. And the truth was, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to see that what I thought was love was, in fact, an illusion, a carefully constructed fantasy that hid darker truths. But of course, that would come later. For now, I was living the life I had always dreamed of. Everything seemed right. But sometimes the things we think are perfect can hide the very flaws we need to see before it's too late. In the next chapter, you'll hear how my world, so carefully crafted and seemingly perfect, started to unravel, and how the love I believed in began to reveal a side I couldn't have imagined. After the wedding in 1972, I felt like I was stepping into the life I had always dreamed of. I was now married to Paul, a man who had quickly become my world. We moved into a small but cozy 2-bedroom house just a few blocks away from my parents. The house was modest, but it was ours, and that's all that mattered to me at the time. I was eager to create a home, to fill the space with warmth and love, just as my mother had done for me. Our mornings started early, with Paul heading off to the bank, looking sharp in his suit and tie. He was always diligent, professional, and kind. The kind of man everyone respected in the town. As for me, I was learning how to run a household. I'd wake up early, make coffee, prepare breakfast, and get ready for the day ahead. I often spent the afternoons embroidering or tending to the small garden in our backyard, growing herbs and flowers, following in my mother's footsteps. There was something so fulfilling about growing your own flowers, just like the ones in the garden I'd grown up with. I remember sitting on the porch many mornings, watching the sun rise over Millville. The days were quiet and peaceful, much like I had imagined when I thought about married life. Our routine was comforting. On weekends, we would often have Sunday dinners at my parents' house, where my father would tell stories of his days managing the general store, and my mother would serve her famous roast chicken. It was the same warmth I had always known, and I was happy to be sharing it with Paul. Life felt simple, even in its challenges. The hardest thing we faced in those early years was learning how to compromise. There were small things, like how we arranged the furniture or who was responsible for what chores around the house. Nothing major, but the kind of adjustments any couple has to make when they start living together. Paul, for instance, was very particular about keeping things organized, while I tended to leave books scattered around, a habit I picked up from my mother. We had our little disagreements, but nothing ever felt insurmountable. I remember the way he looked at me across the dinner table sometimes, a look that said he was proud of me. It was that quiet pride, the kind of thing that made me feel truly appreciated, even on days when I felt like I hadn't done much. He would say, "You're doing a great job, Barbara," even if the dinner wasn't perfect or the laundry was late. Those words meant more than I could have known back then. They made me feel like I was part of something bigger than myself. I was building a life with Paul, and everything seemed possible. The first few years of marriage were filled with small joys, simple pleasures. We didn't have a lot of money, but we didn't need much. We filled our home with laughter, love, and our dreams. I'd often think about having children, imagining the pitter-patter of little feet running through the house. We talked about it a lot, how we'd raise our kids, where they'd go to school, and the kinds of values we would instill in them. In the quiet moments, when it was just the two of us, I would feel a sense of peace that I had never known before. I'd look at Paul and think, this is it. This is what I've always wanted. But I also knew deep down that every marriage goes through phases. There are highs and lows, and sometimes you don't always get what you expect. And even though things felt perfect on the surface, I didn't realize that underneath, there were cracks forming, tiny little shifts that would later grow into something I couldn't ignore. But that was still far off in the future. At the time, I was happy. We were building a life together, and I couldn't imagine it being any other way. Our little house felt like the safest place in the world, and with each passing day, I was more certain that I had found my forever. Little did I know, the foundation we were building was about to be tested in ways I never could have predicted. The first true wave of grief came in 1975 when my mother, Dorothy, fell ill. It all started with complaints of stomach pains, something we initially brushed off as simple stress or perhaps a mild indigestion. My mother, like many women of her time, never took time for herself. She was always busy, always giving to others, whether it was her students at school, the neighbors, or her family. She never complained, never stopped to take a moment to care for herself. I often think that was part of the reason it took so long for us to realize just how serious her condition was. When we finally convinced her to see a doctor, the news was devastating. It was cancer. Stomach cancer, advanced stage. The doctor, an elderly gentleman with a kind face, spoke gently, but the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. 6 months, maybe a year, he said, his voice steady but his eyes filled with pity. It felt like time had stopped right there in that sterile office, the ticking of the clock on the wall almost mocking me as the reality of the situation sunk in. Mom had always been the pillar of our family. She was the one who kept everything together, her gentle strength held our little world in place. To think of losing her was unimaginable. She had been the one to make every holiday feel special, to comfort me when I was sad, and to show me what it meant to love selflessly. But now that very love seemed to be slipping away from us, fading with each passing day. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, pain medications, and sleepless nights. I was by her side as much as I could be, and Paul, my husband, was supportive throughout it all, always helping with the practical matters, driving me to the hospital, bringing me meals when I couldn't bear to cook, and taking over house chores when I was too exhausted to do anything but sit by my mother's bedside. But as much as Paul did for me, it was my father, Jonah, who seemed to retreat into a quiet kind of denial. He continued going about his daily routines, working at the store, speaking in superficial terms about the weather when he visited Mom in the hospital. I could see the pain in his eyes, but he refused to confront it. He never talked about the future, about what would happen if she passed, as if avoiding it would somehow make it less real. I remember one evening, sitting beside my mother in the hospital, holding her fragile hand as I read to her from her favorite book. She had always loved stories, and in those last days I read every passage I knew would bring her comfort. She simply closed her eyes, and just like that she was gone. No dramatic final words, no long goodbyes, just a soft exhale, a peaceful end that felt too quick, too quiet for the woman who had been the heartbeat of our family. The funeral was simple, just like she would have wanted. The community came out in droves to pay their respects, former students and friends bringing flowers, telling stories of how she had touched their lives. My father remained stoic, not shedding a tear, though his hand would occasionally squeeze mine, as if silently checking that I was still here. It was at the funeral, after all the guests had gone, when I realized how lost my father was without her. He was broken in a way I hadn't seen before, and I knew that the world he had built around him, the routine, the control, the stability, was starting to crumble. I sat beside him in the quiet house, watching him stare at their wedding photograph, the same one I had seen 1,000 times before. But now his face was drawn, his eyes clouded with a sadness so deep it seemed to swallow him whole. That was when I knew I couldn't leave him alone. He was my father, and I was the only one left who could try to help him navigate this grief. And so I made a decision that would change everything. I suggested he move in with Paul and me for a while. I didn't think it through completely, I was acting on instinct, wanting to make sure he wasn't alone in his grief. But as we made the arrangements, I began to feel the subtle shifts in our home. The quiet changes that, at the time, seemed so innocent. My father, once the proud, dignified man of the household, was starting to become more of a fixture in our lives. But I never expected what would come next, the way the dynamics of our home would begin to slowly shift in ways that were harder to ignore as time went on. The loss of my mother marked the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, one that would test the strength of our family in ways we had never imagined. And it was only the beginning of what would be a long and painful journey toward understanding who I really was, and who the people I loved truly were. The months following my mother's death marked a significant shift in the rhythm of our home. What I had expected to be a temporary arrangement, Dad living with us for a while until he could stand on his own 2 feet, gradually turned into something more permanent. The line between being a family member and a guest blurred, and my father, who had once been a quiet, respectful presence, seemed to settle into our home in a way that felt more invasive than comforting. Paul and I had always had a solid relationship. We'd met when I was young, fallen in love quickly, and built a life together, or so I thought. But as the days passed after my mother's passing, I noticed subtle but unmistakable changes in Paul's behavior. He became distant, a shadow of the man I had married. It wasn't that he became outright cruel or neglectful, but there was a coldness, a detachment that I couldn't ignore. At first I attributed it to the grief. We were all still reeling from my mother's death, trying to navigate the new reality without her. I told myself that he was just mourning in his own way, that his withdrawal was temporary, a product of the heavy emotions we were all carrying. But as weeks turned into months, I began to realize that something deeper was at play. Paul started coming home later from work, claiming he had to stay at the bank longer, that his workload had increased. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But something in his tone, something in the way he avoided making eye contact, made me uneasy. It wasn't just the late hours, it was the subtle shifts in his mood, the way he started to snap at me for the smallest things. The light-hearted conversations we used to share over dinner became strained, and there was an uncomfortable silence between us more often than not. I started to question my own perceptions. Was I overreacting? Could it simply be the stress of living with my father and the changes that came with it? But the doubts kept growing. I remember one evening, after a quiet dinner where we barely spoke, Paul suddenly looked at me with a hardness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "You're being too sensitive," he said, his voice sharp. "You've been on edge since your mother died, but you can't keep living like this." His words stung, not just because of their harshness but because they felt so distant from the man I had married. I could feel the gap widening between us, like we were no longer the couple we once were. It was as if the connection we had built over the years was slowly unraveling thread by thread. I wanted to talk to him about it, to ask him if he felt the same distance, the same awkwardness between us. But whenever I tried to approach the subject, he would brush it off, telling me that I was just imagining things. "I'm fine," he would say, his eyes darting away from mine. "You're just too caught up in everything that's happened." But as much as I tried to ignore it, the changes were undeniable. Paul, the man who used to be my confidant, my partner in everything, had become more of a stranger with each passing day. I found myself longing for the days when we would talk about our dreams, when we shared little moments of joy without hesitation. Those days seemed so far away now, like a distant memory I couldn't quite reach. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. The more I tried to understand Paul's behavior, the more I realized that perhaps I wasn't just dealing with grief. Perhaps there was something else, something I wasn't yet ready to confront. The tension in the house, the awkward silences, the subtle but growing divide, it was becoming too much to ignore. It was during one of these long, quiet evenings that I overheard a conversation between Paul and my father. I wasn't supposed to be eavesdropping, but as I passed the hallway, I couldn't help but overhear their murmured voices. My heart raced as I listened, trying to make sense of the words that floated toward me. They weren't talking about the mundane, the weather, or work. No, this conversation was different, intense, serious. My father's voice, usually so calm and measured, was laced with something I couldn't quite identify. And Paul, he sounded anxious, almost like he was apologizing. That moment, that single conversation, opened my eyes to something I had been blind to all along. My mind reeled with questions, and fear crept into my chest. What was going on between my husband and my father? Why had the relationship between the two men I trusted most started to feel so secretive, so tense? It was clear that something was changing, but what I didn't know was just how deep the changes ran, and how they would affect me in ways I couldn't yet understand. The next few days would be pivotal, leading me to a truth I wasn't prepared for but would eventually have to face. The woman I had been, the trusting wife, the loyal daughter, was about to be shaken to her core. It's strange how the most dangerous changes can creep into your life so quietly, almost unnoticed, like a shadow that slowly grows darker without you realizing. That's how my father's presence began to shift in our home after my mother's passing. At first it was subtle. A little more silence in the house, a few more glances exchanged between Paul and my father when they thought I wasn't paying attention. But as time went on, I began to notice things that I could no longer ignore. When I invited my father to stay with us, I thought it was a gesture of love, a temporary arrangement that would help him heal from losing my mother. He had always been a quiet man, a man who worked hard, but his emotional distance had always been a source of pain for me. I never really understood why he kept so much of himself hidden, but now, after losing Mom, I wanted to help him find some solace. The first few weeks after he moved in were relatively smooth. He didn't demand much, keeping to himself, and he made a genuine effort to cook for us on Sundays, just as he had when Mom was alive. But there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. I felt as though I was walking on eggshells, trying to maintain a normalcy that was quickly becoming unattainable. Every time I glanced at Paul, I could see it. He was increasingly agitated, always distant, always preoccupied. It was as if having my father in the house was not just a strain on him, but a source of conflict, one that neither of them was willing to confront directly. In those days, I couldn't quite pinpoint what was wrong. I thought maybe it was just the stress of losing Mom, of trying to fill her shoes, to maintain some sense of normalcy. But then as I watched my father more closely, I began to notice something unsettling. He had become more controlling. At first, it was little things, comments about how I should clean the house or what I should wear, but slowly it became more invasive. He started to take over parts of the house. A picture frame I had placed in the living room was moved. A chair I liked to sit in was suddenly in a different position. I brushed it off at first, convincing myself that I was being too sensitive. After all, my father had always been a man of order, a man who liked things a certain way. But then his control began to extend to my marriage. One night, Paul and I were having dinner talking about our day when my father interjected. "Barbara," he said calmly, "you know your husband has a very bad habit of leaving his shoes in the hallway. It doesn't look good, not for a married man. A woman should keep the house in order. Your mother would never have allowed such things." The words stung more than I expected. It wasn't just the criticism, it was the way my father's presence in the house had shifted the balance, had made me feel like I wasn't the one running my own home. I could feel Paul's discomfort as he shifted in his chair, but he said nothing. I wanted to defend myself, to stand up for my marriage, but I was afraid of the confrontation. And so we continued on in this strange, tense coexistence. Paul grew more withdrawn, more resentful, while my father, in his quiet, unassuming way, began to fill every space in the house. His presence became inescapable, a constant reminder that the dynamics of our family were changing in ways I couldn't control. But the most unsettling part was what I couldn't see, the subtle manipulation that had begun to seep into the very fabric of our lives. My father, a man I had always respected but never fully understood, was now changing the course of my life in ways I had yet to comprehend. The worst part was I felt powerless to stop it. It wasn't until later that I realized the true extent of my father's influence and the deeper, darker truths hidden within our home. But in those early days it was like stepping into an abyss, slowly losing my footing, unsure of where the ground was or if it even existed anymore. And the worst part was I didn't know how to escape it. As the months passed, the tension in our home began to grow like a storm cloud on the horizon, darkening everything it touched. At first, I didn't know what was wrong. I thought it was just the strain of my father living with us, or perhaps the stress of losing Mom. But as time went on, I couldn't deny that something much deeper was happening, something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The first signs were subtle, Paul becoming more withdrawn, his smiles less frequent, his responses to my questions shorter. He was always polite, always present, but there was a coldness to him that hadn't been there before. The warmth we once shared began to dissipate, and in its place was a chasm of silence that seemed to stretch between us with each passing day. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the grief of losing my mother or the pressure of having my father in the house. Paul had always been a hard worker, and I knew that the loss of Mom had been particularly difficult for him, too. But as weeks turned into months, I started to notice the little things, the excuses he made for staying late at work, the way he would disappear on weekends, the increasing number of nights he spent away from home. He claimed it was because of work, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I tried to talk to him about it one evening after dinner. "Paul," I said gently, "you've been so distant lately. What's going on? Is everything okay?" He looked at me, his face unreadable. "I'm fine, Barbara. Just a little tired, that's all. Work is a lot more stressful these days." But I knew it wasn't just work. The tone in his voice was defensive, almost dismissive. And the way he avoided eye contact, it was as if he was hiding something he didn't want me to know. It wasn't just Paul, though. My father's presence in the house was starting to feel more like a constant weight, a pressure that I couldn't escape. His criticisms became more frequent, more cutting. The way he would comment on the smallest things, how I kept the house, how I dressed, how I spoke, it all started to feel like he was trying to control every aspect of my life. And I couldn't understand why. After all, he was my father, a man who had always been distant but not controlling. What had changed? One evening, after another quiet dinner where my father sat in his usual chair, making comments about everything from the food to the placement of the silverware, I found myself questioning everything. I looked at Paul across the table, his eyes cast downward, and I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. He wasn't the man I had married, the man who once held me close and whispered that everything would be okay. He had become someone else, someone I didn't know. But the most unsettling part of it all was the growing suspicion that there were things I didn't know, secrets being kept from me. The conversations I overheard between Paul and my father, the strange looks they exchanged, the way my father would speak to Paul in a tone that I couldn't quite decipher, it all pointed to something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being left out of a secret, a family secret that was slowly consuming us. As the tension in our home continued to grow, I began to feel trapped. I wanted to confront Paul, to ask him directly what was going on, but each time I tried, I was met with evasion or excuses. And my father, who I thought I could always rely on, seemed to be pulling strings behind the scenes, weaving a web of control that I couldn't see but could feel in every corner of our house. The once quiet, peaceful home I had built with Paul now felt like a battleground, a place where love had been replaced by suspicion, where the foundation we had built our lives on seemed to be crumbling beneath us. And the worst part was I didn't know how to stop it, or if I even could. In the silence that enveloped us each night, as Paul turned his back to me in bed and my father's heavy footsteps echoed through the halls, I felt something shifting, something I couldn't put into words. And I realized that the family I had known, the family I thought I understood, was no longer the same. The secrets, the lies, and the tension had seeped into the very walls of our home, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come to light. It was a crisp October morning when I finally uncovered the truth that had been lurking in the shadows of my home, a truth I had felt in my bones but could never quite reach. The moments leading up to my discovery had been like an ever-tightening knot in my chest, a knot that finally unraveled in a single, devastating instant. I had grown increasingly uneasy in the weeks before, noticing more and more the way Paul had begun to pull away. The tension between us was palpable, thickening the air in our home like a storm cloud that refused to break. Yet it wasn't just Paul's distance that weighed on me. My father, once so quiet and reserved, had started to change too. He no longer kept to himself. Instead, he hovered around, offering unsolicited advice, scrutinizing everything I did. The once peaceful home I had cherished had become a place filled with secrets and unspoken truths. On this particular day, I had returned home early from the market, hoping to surprise Paul with his favorite homemade soup. I thought it would bring some warmth back to the house, perhaps rekindle the affection we had once shared. As I walked through the front door, I heard voices coming from our bedroom, voices that didn't belong to me or Paul. I froze in the hallway, my hand still on the doorknob as I recognized the low murmurs of my father and Paul. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to hear what was happening on the other side of that door. But something in me urged me to listen, to understand what was being said. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to catch the words. I couldn't make out everything, but one phrase pierced through the rest. "You owe me, Paul," my father said, his voice heavy with authority. The words hit me like a slap, sending a cold shiver down my spine. Oh me! What could my husband possibly owe my father? They had always been cordial, polite, and distant, never close, but never antagonistic either. What kind of agreement had they made? I stepped back, my heart racing as I tried to process the weight of what I had just heard. Before I could gather my thoughts, the door opened. Paul stepped out, his face pale, his eyes avoiding mine. He looked at me briefly, but there was something in his expression, a mix of guilt and fear, that made my stomach churn. "Barbara," he said softly, almost apologetically. "I didn't expect you back so soon." I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying to calm my racing heart. "Paul," I began, my voice trembling, "what did my father mean by that? What do you owe him?" Paul's gaze flickered, and I saw a momentary flash of panic before he regained his composure. "It's nothing, Barbara. Just something from the past. Don't worry about it." But his words felt hollow. My instincts screamed that there was more, that the distance between us wasn't just the strain of everyday life. It was something much deeper, something darker, something I wasn't prepared to face. I could see the avoidance in his eyes, the way he struggled to meet my gaze. And yet, despite the burning questions swirling in my mind, I chose to swallow my doubts for the moment. I had to know the truth. Later that evening, I confronted Paul once again, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Paul, what is going on? Why do you keep avoiding me? What did my father mean when he said you owed him? What are you hiding from me?" Paul looked at me, his face hardening. The calm facade he had maintained for so long seemed to crack. "It's not what you think, Barbara," he said, his voice low. "I never wanted you to be caught up in this. But the truth is, your father, he helped me out when I was in a difficult place. And he made me a promise. If I did certain things for him, he would take care of me, take care of our future." I felt the room spin as the weight of his words settled on my shoulders. "What kind of things, Paul?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, looking away. "It's complicated. I didn't think it would come to this. But now it's all falling apart." I could feel the betrayal in my chest, the sharp sting of realization. My husband, the man I had trusted with my heart, had been caught in a web of manipulation, a web spun by my own father. I felt like I was drowning, surrounded by secrets, trapped in a family where love had turned into something unrecognizable. The truth began to unfold like a terrible dream. My father's influence over Paul had been more than just financial, it was personal too. There had been a silent agreement between them, one that went beyond mere loans or favors. It was a bond, a promise made in shadows that I had never been meant to see. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my heart breaking with each word. Paul's silence was the answer. He had kept his loyalty to my father at the cost of everything else, his marriage, his integrity, and now my trust. As I stood there, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overtake me, I realized something crucial. I wasn't just confronting a man who had lied to me, I was confronting the very foundation of my life, the family I thought I knew. And the weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. I couldn't keep living in this house of lies. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when the truth was a knife twisting deeper into my soul. It was time to face what had been hidden from me, to finally see the truth for what it was. And in the end, I knew that facing the truth was the only way I could ever find peace again. The days that followed the discovery were some of the hardest I had ever faced. I moved through my house like a ghost, trying to hold it all together, pretending that nothing had changed, though everything had. My thoughts spun in a dizzying circle of confusion, disbelief, and quiet anger. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted the very people who had betrayed me in the worst possible way? But I knew one thing for certain: the time had come to confront the lies, to tear apart the web of deceit that had entangled our lives. I couldn't live like this anymore, walking on eggshells, pretending that everything was fine when my world had been turned upside down. I decided to confront both Paul and my father at the same time. There was no more room for avoidance or half-truths. I needed the answers, and I needed them now. It wasn't just about uncovering the betrayal, it was about reclaiming the truth for myself, about finding closure. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm determination rise within me. The woman I was, broken and unsure, was slowly being replaced by a woman who could stand tall, who could look her family in the eye and demand honesty. That evening after dinner, I asked Paul to stay in the living room. I told my father to come join us, that we needed to talk about everything, no more secrets, no more half-explanations. The tension in the air was palpable as they both entered the room. My father, who had once been my pillar, now seemed smaller, diminished by his own guilt. Paul, too, appeared uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. "I need to know everything," I began, my voice steady but filled with the weight of all the pain I had carried in silence. "I want to know the truth about your agreement, Paul, about the lies you've both been hiding. I want the truth, every single detail." Paul shifted in his seat, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come easily. I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the guilt that weighed him down. My father, always so authoritative, sat stiffly beside him, his eyes on the floor. "You both think I didn't know," I continued, looking from Paul to my father. "But I did. I overheard your conversation, Paul. I heard what you owe him. I heard the way he controls you." My father's face tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. He was clearly trying to maintain his composure, but the cracks were starting to show. "Barbara," he said, his voice strained, "this is between me and Paul. You don't understand, eh?" "No," I interrupted sharply. "I understand more than you think. I understand that you've both been playing me for years. I understand that everything I believed about my marriage was a lie. But what I don't understand, Paul, is why you let this happen. Why didn't you protect me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Paul's silence spoke volumes. He didn't have the answers, and I could see that. There was nothing he could say to undo the damage, to erase the trust that had been shattered. My father finally spoke, his voice low but laced with venom. "You don't know what you're asking, Barbara. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made for this family. For you. But what about the sacrifice I made?" I replied, my voice trembling with emotion. "What about the years I spent in this house, believing I was loved, believing I was safe? All this time, I was just a pawn in your game." The silence that followed felt like a heavy weight pressing down on the room. My father shifted uncomfortably while Paul's head hung low in shame. I could see that the truth was starting to seep into the cracks of their facades, that they were beginning to feel the weight of their actions. But despite the discomfort, I knew that this confrontation, painful as it was necessary. It was the only way to break free from the shackles of their lies. "I'm done," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I can't do this anymore. I won't live in this house of secrets and manipulation." For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of empowerment, of release. I wasn't the helpless wife who had to endure this anymore. I wasn't the daughter who had to forgive and forget. I was standing up for myself, demanding the truth, and reclaiming my life. "I want you both to leave," I said, turning to my father. "I don't care what it takes, but I will not live like this any longer." The room was still. My father looked at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and regret. Paul, too, seemed lost, unsure of what to do next. But for the first time in years, I felt in control. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I was taking the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming my life. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the strength I needed to move forward. In the days following the confrontation, everything in the house felt different, heavy, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the once familiar spaces now felt foreign. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and the thought of staying in that house, living in that environment, was unbearable. The weight of the lies, the betrayal, the emotional wounds were more than I could carry. But amidst the chaos, something shifted inside me, a quiet, powerful realization that it was time to leave. Leaving wasn't easy. It felt like cutting a part of myself away, but I knew deep down that it was the only way I could begin to heal. I had lived in that house for years, believing in the illusion of love and safety, but now it had become a prison. I had allowed myself to be bound by fear, guilt, and the desperate hope that things would get better. But I finally understood, things wouldn't change unless I made the change myself. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know where I would go or how I would rebuild my life, but I knew that staying in that toxic environment wasn't an option anymore. My body was exhausted, my spirit battered, and my heart, once full of love and trust, was now fractured. I couldn't stay in the same place pretending that everything would be okay. That decision, the decision to leave, was the most empowering choice I'd ever made. But it was also the hardest. I had to let go of the life I thought I had, the dream of a perfect marriage, the hope that things could go back to the way they were. I had to let go of the father I thought I knew and the man I had once loved. The first step was telling Paul. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat, but I knew I had to say them. "I'm leaving," I told him, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "I can't live like this anymore. I can't be a part of this anymore." He looked at me, his face a mixture of guilt, regret, and confusion. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me as if trying to process the enormity of what I was saying. But I knew the truth now and I couldn't turn back. As I began packing, the weight of the decision felt more real with every item I placed in the suitcase. But there was also a glimmer of hope in my heart, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape, mine to rebuild. I was no longer trapped in the cycle of fear and lies. I was taking control of my own life, and that gave me a strength I hadn't known I had. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to walk it. One step at a time, I would find my way back to myself. And with every step, I would heal and rebuild and reclaim the life I deserved. Leaving was just the beginning. The next chapter of my life was all about starting over, rebuilding, rediscovering, and finding justice not just in the eyes of others, but in my own heart. It was terrifying, uncertain, and at times it felt like an uphill battle. But I knew deep down that I had to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me. I was determined to be free, to rebuild, and to find the justice I had long been denied. At first, I didn't know where to go or what to do. I had no savings, no safety net, just the clothes on my back and a fierce determination to survive. Sally, my trusted friend, welcomed me into her home with open arms. It was a small, humble apartment, but it was a safe haven, a place where I could breathe, where I didn't have to look over my shoulder, wondering if I would see his face again. I spent my first few weeks in a daze trying to process everything that had happened, trying to find the strength to rebuild from the ground up. But even in the darkest moments, there was a small light flickering within me, a reminder that I could make something of my life, that I could turn this pain into purpose. I applied for a job at a local diner, and although it was nothing glamorous, it was a start. With each paycheck, I began to feel a sense of independence that I had never known before. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Slowly, I started to make small improvements in my life. I took a few courses at a local community college just to keep my mind occupied, to remind myself that I had a future, that my story wasn't over yet. As I began to regain some stability, I also started thinking about what had happened to me, about the betrayal, the abuse, the way my trust had been shattered. I realized that I needed to do something about it, not just for myself, but for others who might be suffering in silence as I had. I decided to take legal action. I filed for divorce, and though it was a painful process, it was also empowering. The idea of walking into that courtroom and standing up for myself against the man who had tried to break me was a victory in itself. The legal proceedings were long and exhausting. I had to revisit painful memories, recount events I had spent years trying to forget. But through it all, I found my voice. And with each step I took, I felt stronger. Justice didn't come easily, but it came. The truth came to light, and Paul was held accountable for his actions. It wasn't the closure I had imagined, but it was a form of justice that brought me a sense of peace. It was also in these years of rebuilding that I began to truly heal. I learned that healing wasn't a linear path, but a journey with ups and downs. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, when the memories would haunt me, but there were also mornings when I woke up with a new sense of hope, when I felt like I was finally taking control of my life. And then years later, I met Charles. He was kind, patient, and understanding in a way I had never known. With him, I found love again, not the kind of love I had been taught to expect, the kind that was conditional and controlled, but the kind of love that was free, mutual, and unconditional. Charles never tried to change me, never tried to control me. He loved me for who I was, the flaws, scars, and all. Together, we built a new life. We got married, and we had 2 children, both of whom were raised in an environment of respect, trust, and love. They grew up knowing the value of kindness, equality, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Every day, I was reminded that no matter how broken we may feel, we have the power to heal, to rebuild, and to transform our pain into something meaningful. Through all of this, I learned that reclaiming our lives is possible. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't come without effort, but with determination, support, and the courage to move forward, it's possible. I found justice not just in the courts, but in the way I learned to live again, in the love I built with Charles, and in the strength I found in myself. In the end, I learned that the most important thing is not what happens to us, but how we choose to respond to it. We can let our past define us, or we can choose to define our future. And as for me, I chose to live a life of love, healing, and strength. Forgiveness is not something we often give easily, especially when the wounds run deep, when trust has been shattered in ways that leave scars both visible and invisible. But as I embarked on my journey of healing, I realized that forgiveness was not just for those who had wronged me, it was for me. It was the key to unlocking the door to my own freedom. And though it took time, I found that true empowerment came not from holding onto the anger, but from releasing it. For so long, I carried the weight of betrayal, the kind that didn't just affect my marriage, but affected my very sense of self. I allowed the actions of others to define me, to shape my view of the world. But forgiveness was my way out. It wasn't about excusing the pain that had been caused, but rather choosing to no longer let it control my life. I realized that by holding on to resentment, I was allowing my past to continue influencing my present, and I refused to let that happen any longer. Forgiveness didn't happen in one moment. It was a gradual process, one that required deep reflection and, at times, a lot of tears. But through that process, I began to see that I was stronger than I had ever believed. I wasn't defined by what had been done to me, I was defined by how I chose to rise from it. One of the most liberating moments came when I finally forgave Paul. I had held so much anger toward him for his complicity, for the lies he told, for the betrayal of our marriage. But the more I reflected on the years I had spent with him, the more I realized that his actions came from his own weaknesses, his own insecurities, and his inability to stand up for what was right. When I forgave him, I wasn't letting him off the hook for what he had done. I was freeing myself from the chains of anger that had kept me bound for so long. As I forgave him, I began to understand that empowerment was not about having power over others. It was about reclaiming control of my own life, my own choices. It was about setting boundaries, about making decisions that honored my worth and my well-being. Empowerment came from within. It came from choosing to walk away from the toxic patterns of the past and stepping into a future where I was free to live on my own terms. I found strength in my vulnerability and my ability to confront the past, and in the courage to rebuild. As I let go of the weight of anger, I embraced the lightness that came with forgiveness. I realized that breaking free from the past didn't mean forgetting it, it meant not letting it dictate my future. And as I moved forward, I carried with me the lessons I had learned, that true empowerment comes from within, and that forgiveness is the key to truly setting yourself free. As I sit here reflecting on everything I've been through, I'm reminded of how much strength we have within us, even in the darkest of times. Life has a way of testing us, pushing us to our limits, and forcing us to confront things we never thought we'd face. But it's in those very moments of struggle that we find out just how strong we really are. When I think back on my journey, I see a woman who once felt broken, lost, and alone. I see a woman who allowed others' actions to define her, who thought her worth was determined by the love, or lack thereof, of others. But that woman is no longer who I am. She was replaced by someone who found the courage to rise up, to heal, and to rebuild a life filled with hope and possibility. I think about the love I've received along the way, the love that's been my foundation through every hardship. From the moment I found the courage to forgive, I began to see how powerful love really is. It's not just about romantic love, it's the love of friends, the love of family, and most importantly, the love we have for ourselves. It's the kind of love that empowers us to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead feels uncertain. Sally, for example, was a beacon of love and light during some of my darkest days. She never hesitated to offer a hand when I needed it most. It was her kindness that gave me the strength to step out of that house and leave behind everything I had known. That's the kind of love I hold dear, the love that says you're not alone and you don't have to carry this burden by yourself. And then there's my children, who have been my greatest teachers in all of this. They've shown me what true resilience looks like. When I watch them grow, flourish, and thrive, I'm reminded that the cycle of pain and hurt does not have to continue. They are the living proof that we can rewrite the narrative, that we can break free from the chains of the past and build a better future for ourselves and for those who come after us. Looking back, I realize that the strength I now carry isn't just my own, it's the culmination of all the love and support I've received from those around me. It's the strength I learned from my mother, who never let go of the love she had for me even in her final days. It's the strength I inherited from the women who came before me, who endured their own hardships with grace and courage. They set the example for me, and now I carry that legacy forward. And while I've had to make difficult decisions and confront painful truths, I know that I've done it all with love and with the desire to create a life that reflects my true worth. I've learned that love isn't always easy, it's not always what we expect or want, and sometimes it requires us to let go of things, people, and even our own ideas of how things should be. But in the end, love is the only thing that will carry us through. I've left behind a past that once defined me, and I've embraced a future that I'm building with my own hands, with love as my guide. It hasn't been easy, but I know that each step I take brings me closer to the life I've always deserved. And as I look forward, I know that I am not defined by what happened to me, but by how I choose to live in the face of it all. So to anyone out there who might be struggling, who might feel trapped by their circumstances or weighed down by their past, know that there is always hope. You are not alone. You have within you the strength to overcome, to heal, and to create a life filled with the love you deserve. Your story is not finished, and you have the power to shape the future in ways you can't yet imagine. With all the love and strength in my heart, I encourage you to keep going, to keep fighting for the life you want. The legacy of strength and love is one that we can all pass on. It's never too late to start anew.